I have 12:02. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. I'm Anna Guest, registered dietitian and nutrition coordinator for the Ohio Beef Council. On behalf of American Dairy Association Mideast and Ohio Beef Council, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. Before we begin, I do have a few housekeeping items. Please feel free to customize your screen. You can adjust the viewing settings and move the presenter video that best fits your screen. We want to make today's experience as interactive as possible, so please submit your questions or comments to the Q&A box at any time, and we'll do our best to answer those at the conclusion of the presentation. If you haven't already, please make sure your full name is visible here on Zoom so we can take attendance of today's audience. And lastly, this presentation will be recorded. Our first panelist today is Stan Smith, Ohio State University Extension Program Assistant of Agriculture and Natural Resources in Fairfield County. Our first topic area is agriculture in Ohio. What do we grow and raise and why? So Stan, first I'll have you introduce yourselves and give us an overview of your role in agriculture.
Thanks, Anna. I am Stan Smith. I work for Ohio State University Extension in Fairfield County, which is just southeast of Columbus. I was born and raised in Fairfield County and actually continue to farm here with one of my sons. All the boys remain active in agriculture to some degree, but one is full-time on the farm and at this point in my time is my legs and arms much of the time. So we do continue to actively farm row crops, have a small brood cow herd, market freezer beef. Majority of those go that way, but with extension, I began as a farm management position in multiple counties in 1986, and a couple of years later became what they call program assistant in Fairfield County, and have continued there since then. I began a beef oriented newsletter through the university about 25 years ago, I guess, and continue to edit that with the help of a lot of good colleagues at Extension. So that's basically what I do.
Thank you. So our first question for you is, in the first presentation we did in this series, we had Dr. Frank Mittlener. And his presentation, he discussed that ruminants are the only animals that can digest cellulose, and that the distribution of cropland in many areas of the US is ideal for growing cellulose-based plants that those ruminants consume. So how is this sentiment reflected in Ohio and the use of Ohio land for crop and cattle production?
Well, much the same way as it is throughout the country. About 30% of the country's land is not suitable for tillage or those types of crops and needs to maintain grass for the most part for ruminant consumption. And we're much the same here in Ohio. And I've got a map that if you want to put it up, I can maybe explain a little better. Obviously, this is Ohio. And some time ago, a glacier came across the state. And the one that we think most about is what they call the Wisconsin. It came down from the northwest, and you can see on that map where it's labeled the Allegheny Plateau, a lot of mountains in the eastern part of the state. Excuse me. So as we think about Ohio, we see that for the most part, it's relatively flat until we get about 2/3 the way across the state. And then we see a lot of mountains throughout the rest of the state. So if you want to pull out that other map or the other picture that I have, we could show you a little more of this. So as you recall where the mountains are, as we look at southeastern Ohio, what we find is the glacier, as it stopped there and we got into those unglaciated areas, we've got rock a whole lot closer to the surface in that part of the state, less topsoil, areas that are very hilly, maybe not as conducive to the tillage of crops that we see in the northwestern 2/3 of the state. Those areas are flatter, variable soils. As the glacier came across, it pushed some topsoil into some lower areas. It created streams, those sorts of things as it receded. But for the most part, areas that can be safely tilled without risk of erosion and those sorts of things. You see, I've got two counties circled, Muskingum and Adams, and they lay right along the ridge of where that glacier stopped. And the reason I've circled those is because those are the two most populous counties.
Oh, Stan, we got you muted.
There we go. Let's try that. There we go. The two most populous cow counties in Ohio, with about 10 to 12,000 what we call brood cows or mama cows, the type of cattle that are typically out on grass the majority of the year. They have babies once a year. Those calves are weaned and then typically sold and fed somewhere else. But it's interesting that those most populous counties are right at the edge of where the glacier stopped and the unglaciated areas start. A lot of topsoil was bulldozed up into some hilly areas there. So the reason we find that some of those counties along that ridge maybe aren't growing as much corn and soybeans is because they are more subject to erosion. But in a case like some of those counties along those ridges, there's a lot of topsoil there pushed up on those hills that allows for very productive grass. As we move east on over to West Virginia and Pennsylvania, we continue to have cow and calf country, but perhaps soils that are less productive as rock gets closer to the surface. And Dr. Turner talked about that and his experience there perhaps in a few minutes, so I won't steal a lot of that thunder. But as we look at the soils and their productivity levels and what they're best suited to do, we simply find that those hills underlaid with rock aren't as conducive to growing corn and soybeans, and we risk erosion and those sorts of things. So they're best if they're covered in grass, and cattle continue to harvest that grass, recycle it into manure nutrients. It goes back into the soil. Also, by having those grasses harvested, they remain green. If you can imagine your lawn being allowed to grow and never be cut, it will eventually turn brown. The goal of any grass plant is to recreate itself, make seed, and once it does that, it begins to dry and become dead, much like we see wheat as it turns golden in July. So the fact that cattle are constantly harvesting the grass, keeping it vegetative, recycling it, and it goes around and around, continues to grow, keeps those areas vegetative. A couple other points as we look at the rest of the state. When the glacier came across, it did some really funky things in places. North Central Ohio, we think of as muck crop area, and up in Huron County, we have a village city called Celerytown, where we actually have research facility for muck crops. What are muck crops? Basically, we're talking radishes, parsley, onions, cilantro, those types of things. They grow best in those muck soils that remain up there. So that's highest and best use up there for those soils happens to be those types of crops. And we find that throughout much of the state. As we move into the western part of the state, a lot of topsoil was left, very productive for corn and soybeans, not as subject to erosion. So as we look at Ohio, it's very diverse, much like the rest of the country. But as our pioneers, our settlers, those folks before us discovered, different soils are more suitable for different things. And we found that southeastern Ohio, or basically that third of Ohio on the southeast side, due to its soil properties, is best left in grass. And ruminant animals are what can harvest grass the best and keep it vegetative.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess I never really considered how the glacier and the geography of Ohio impacts what we grow and why we grow across the state. Would you say there's a difference in acreage needed for cattle production versus fruit and vegetable production, or is it more about the soil quality?
Well, let me talk about the different acreages that are required for cattle. If we were to graze cattle in Western Ohio in some of those more productive soils, and there are some cows over there that are grazing, um, in some cases because they're corners of fields or corners that have been cut off by highways and that. Those soils are very productive. We might put one cow calf pair per acre over there and be able to comfortably provide enough feed for her into the middle part of summer. As we move east, those soils become less productive. We might be able to do 2 acres per cow and calf in Muskingum, and or at least parts of Muskingum and Adams County and some counties along that ridge. As we move into eastern Ohio, we've got folks over in Belmont County and Monroe and those areas that talk about just hoping to be able to keep one cow calf pair on 10 acres. As we look out west, we will find places in the Western United States that talk about needing 15, 20, or 30 acres per cow calf pair. And it's not like they're put on that acreage and left there constantly, but they're rotated, part of the management plan. You allow them to eat it. You hopefully allow them to leave half of the vegetation there so it can recover very quickly, keep cover on the soil, and also be able to photosynthesize and regenerate itself more quickly. But there's no question that productivity is tremendously different from one side to the other. And it's because of the properties the glacier left us. If we're underlaid with rock near the surface, we don't have the water holding capacity, and rock does not transfer a lot of nutrients to the roots of plants. It takes soil to do that. So the deeper those soils, the more productive they tend to be. And we find those in that area north and west of that ridge of mountains.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And that really leads us into our next panelist as we further talk about the soil. Our next topic is environmental stewardship with our second panelist, Dr. Tom Turner of Turner Shorthorns. Dr. Turner, would you give us a quick synopsis of your background and your farm?
Thank you, Anna. My background is really in academia. I grew up on a farm, and that led to where we are now. But in the meantime, I was a professor of animal science at Ohio State and taught beef production and among other subject matters there, and did some research as well into weaning age, looking at milk production in beef cows and some other things like that. Currently, upon retirement 10 and a half years ago, we took on a property here in Perry County that is reclaimed from silica mining. And we're now running about, currently about 70 mama cows on this property. And that's kept us busy, and it's caused me to do more background and work in studying plant health and how to manage these reclaimed soils.
Excellent. So speaking of those soils, tell us a little bit more about the state of the soil on the property when you first purchased it. What practices were implemented in order to improve the soil health?
We bought this just as this mining company was ending here. They were here on this property for about 25 years mining silica and taking about 25 feet of rock from this farm by stripping, as in some of you are familiar with the coal strip mines, where we remove all the topsoil and subsoil, take, in this case, the rock out, and then put that subsoil back and hopefully some topsoil on top of that. So that's what was here when we got here. Though it doesn't get released until that mining company, there's some government oversight there. The mining company has to do certain things before they'll release it. And they had done those things fairly well. But we got here and it was beginning to be a little bit overgrown. There'd been no livestock on here for whatever areas that they had then seeded. And so that was how we started. There was no fencing or houses or barns or anything here. So we started from scratch basically and have been working at that ever since. Actually, I didn't say that quite right. We actually bought the property 20 years ago, and we moved here about 13 years ago. So then after that 13 years ago, we started bringing in cows and have expanded. We had, I think, 5 calves the first year we calved in 2010, and now we're having between 50 and 70.
Wow. So what role do the cattle play in the health of the land and of the soil?
Well, I thought Stan did a good job of explaining that. But what we've done is somewhat intensive grazing, not as intense as some, because water is the problem in making sure our or getting paddocks to a smaller scale. So we rotate, and we are doing it. We just moved our cows this morning about every 2 days to a paddock. We have about 160 acres of grass. Remainder is in trees, and we have about 30 paddocks that those cows graze through. So they come back at least, we try to stay out of them at least 6 weeks. So they come in, just as Stan said, we'll literally mow that grass down. They'll eat it down in a couple of days. We move on to the next place, and then that plant will regenerate. And the system of moving cows like that will strengthen the roots of the plant. So the plant becomes healthier and hopefully more productive. And one of our issues is water management, trying to control erosion, as all farmers do. But if you strengthen that plant and it has stronger root reserves, then it'll grow quicker. And when the rain comes, it'll help trap more of the rain instead of running off. With these soils, the way they're put back, one of the challenges is that there's not a standard soil structure. They will push whatever material they have and then put some and spread some topsoil on top of it and seed it. Well, what we've experienced is if we start erosion, or if erosion gets started in one place, then it's very difficult to get it stopped, because the soil under the topsoil will just literally wash away. So we have spent a lot of time and effort in pushing back in the gullies, material we can get, and redoing that process in spots all over our farm. And we have one more area we're working on, hopefully get that done this summer, but we have made significant progress, and our grasses have gotten better. We are able to run more cows now on the same ground, and we do not use commercial fertilizers here at all. So by having cows out year round, they're never housed, and we unroll our hay. We take hay out to them in large round bale packages and unroll that hay either down a hill or by the use of a unroller on the back of our tractor. And that spreads the manure. It spreads whatever in that hay bale that they will not eat or they refuse to eat. That spreads that. And so we typically unroll in what we have identified as our weaker areas to try to improve the fertility and health of that soil over time.
Excellent. So the cattle, by grazing, are naturally fertilizing the soil?
Yes, the manure goes there, obviously, and it actually is easier than hauling manure. We do have an occasion a few cows in barns when we calve and so forth, but we don't like to haul manure. So we'd rather have the cows do that automatically when they're out there. And that, obviously, over time, the other thing cows will do in reclaimed ground is they will spread seeds to other areas. If we have a plant, a certain kind, let's talk about orchard grass, for example, in one area and not so much in another area, as they consume that plant and then we move them to a new area, that passes through their body. There's about a 72-hour rate of passage in beef cows. So then they'll deposit those seeds in other areas. So we eventually spread out various seeds, and those plants will find where they can grow. It may not work in this area as well as they do in another area. So eventually we get, hopefully, better plants and more productive plants.
Fascinating. It sounds like the cattle take out a lot of your physical labor by helping you plant the grasses and fertilize.
Well, that would be the idea. We are a purebred operation with purebred shorthorns. We grow seed stock, but as Stan can attest, there's not a lot of profit in the cow business. And one of the things we have to constantly look at is how to decrease inputs, how to let the cows do the labor for you, not have excessive buildings, excessive equipment, or buy a lot of fertilizer or other things. We prefer to we think we can manage cows so that they can exist on this property without lots of inputs. And that's part of our cow selection, is finding cows over time that can survive in our system. This is what we offer to the cow. And if she can't survive or flourish in this system, then she probably isn't going to last here very long.
That makes sense. Thank you. Well, thank you. I'm going to turn things over to Karen as she asks our questions of the next two panelists.
Thank you, Stan and Dr. Turner, for the great overview of especially agriculture, I think, in the southeast part of Ohio. So I'm Karen Bakes. I'm a registered dietitian with the American Dairy Association Mideast, and I'd like to introduce our next panelist, which is Chris Weaver. And Chris is the owner-operator of Bridgewater Dairy in Montpelier, Ohio, which is in the northwest corner of Ohio, kind of where Indiana, Michigan, Ohio all come together there. And he's going to talk more about how technology research is used in agriculture and the farm. So Chris, are you unmuted and have your video up?
I'm ready to go.
Oh, great. Okay. Can you give us just a brief overview of your farm up here in Northwest Ohio?
Yeah, Bridgewater Dairy Group is really, we call it a Bridgewater Dairy Group. We started Bridgewater Dairy in 1998. My father and I moved here and built this modern dairy, 2,000 cows, and here in Ohio. And over the course of the last 23 years, first we grew it up to from 2,000 milking cows up to 3,000 milking cows in about 2008.
So you have one of the larger farms up in this area.
Growing our. Say that again.
Go ahead. I say you have one of the larger farms in Ohio.
Yeah. So we grew from 2,000 cows up to 3,000 cows, and then per dairy in about 2011, and we're now milking 4,500 cows in both in Montpelier, Ohio, and Lyons, Ohio, and we also farm about 5,000 acres of cropland to support the dairy operation here in Montpelier. And then in Lyons, we work with some local farmers to manage crops.
Great. You know, we've heard more and more about how technology is being used on farms to improve efficiencies. And with a farm that size, can you share with us how you use technology and research on your farm?
I feel like I love technology, and I feel like I just dabble in technology compared to what's available for the dairy industry. The list kind of can go on. We started out with just some basically feed management software that would help us manage the way we feed the cows, making sure that from a nutritionist perspective, we have a ration that we put in, and that will control the scale so the employee can put the ration directly together, up to putting a wireless network in our facility so we can track some cow data, as well as putting cameras in to monitor employee and cow performance. To make sure that people are doing what they're supposed to be doing, especially if a cow needs food in front of them. We want the cow to be comfortable and happy, so we want to make sure that they have feed in front of them 24 hours a day. And usually at the 2 a.m. hour is the guy doing that job, making sure the food is up in front of the cow or not. So we'll push that feed up. There's kind of the sky's limit in technology. There's actually cameras now that will actually, that I'm researching putting in, that will take a picture of the cow, and it'll look at that cow to score her on a lameness level to see how lame she is, or if her feet are injured, and then you can take that data, and an employee can go and look for that cow and make sure that that cow's feet are taken care of and repaired, hopefully. So there's a lot of options there, but we're just kind of touching. But I love the technology piece, so, for sure.
That's interesting. Now, you know, we talk about, because in Ohio, I think the average dairy farm is about 140 cows on a farm. And you obviously are on that high end, where we have some other dairy farmers that even have a smaller number than that. So does this kind of technology, would it work on both a large farm like yours and a smaller farm, or what would be some of the differences or similarities?
A lot of this technology is really pretty scalable. It really is very scalable. It's just a number of how many units do you need of what, right? So like the cameras is how many cameras do I need per barn, or even the feed software. The big expense for a farmer is the tractor and the feed wagon, and so the scale is relatively inexpensive. or the lameness detection is also scalable. And which locations are you putting in your barns and stuff? So because of that, is, you know, probably you get some of that stuff you wouldn't maybe put on a 100 cow dairy, but maybe more for a 500 or 700 cow dairy. As you get into where you're managing people, that's when you probably want to enter into the technology stuff, managing people, and then just tracking. You're not as just being, it's a new way to be close to the cows along with walking them, so you're seeing everything every day.
And we know that, you know, there are several dairy farmers in Ohio who have now put in robotic milkers. And actually, if you go up to our website at drink-milk.com, you can see what some of those actually look like. It's not a technology you're using, but it is being used in your area.
Sorry, you blipped real quickly. So what was the technology you're talking about?
About robotic milkers?
Oh yeah, correct. We're not using robotic milkers. It's actually I've done a lot of research into it, very intrigued with it. Pretty high expense. It does remove labor from the milking equation. But right now it's hard to see that coming into some of the larger dairies. I do know of 2,000-3,000 cow dairies that are on all robots, but it's a really, really big upfront expense, and takes the right person to have that kind of money, capital, I should say.
So lots of use of technology, you know, and I also think about one of the questions that I get is, or I think about is, with that many cows, that means that you have lots of manure. So what are you doing with the manure on your farm?
We do have lots of manure. We're required in Ohio to store it for a minimum of 6 months, basically to get to the winter season. And then we have rules, and really rules, but then also just what things we manage to make sure we're doing what's right for the soil. So the rules require us to only put manure on the fields in certain situations. But then practically, we're gonna put the manure on our fields when it's best for the field and for the crop. So right now we're actively planting corn and putting manure out on these fields. And but this winter, in preparation for that, we took samples of our manure, and we also took samples of every 2 years we take a sample of every field down to a 15-acre zone. So we know what the needs are for that soil in terms of nutrients. And comparing that with the manure nutrients and what the soil needs, then we will actually create a prescription that we will inject into the computer, put the program in the computer, and then as the applicator is driving across the field, he can actually increase or decrease the amount of manure in the that he's putting out, so that we're making sure that we hit the right nutrients, we don't exceed too many nutrients in the soil, and manage it that way. We also, there's lots of other things we're doing, but that's the key thing that we're doing to manage the manure: storing it and then putting it on the right time, the right place, and when the ground conditions are right, to soak it in and keep the nutrients down.
What are some other things that you're doing in regards to protecting the environment or recycling some of the resources that you have from the farm?
So one of the key things we've done in 2008, we installed a methane digester, and that digester is actually taking methane, heating up the manure, and taking that manure to about 100 degrees, which releases a gas, and that gas then is converted into electricity. And as time has gone on, we're actually working with another renewable energy company that is going to actually take that gas and scrub it and inject it back into a natural gas pipeline and use it for natural gas plants across the United States. And really, methane is just natural gas. It's just a little bit of a dirty natural gas, but we scrub it and they'll inject that. That's the one larger scale thing that's probably not a super scalable technology. You got to group a bunch of dairies together to do that, to make it cost effective. But on a smaller scale, that's very scalable, we do a lot of cover cropping. Dairy industry is really very well situated to prevent erosion and retain nutrients in the soil, because alfalfa and wheat are two crops that we feed and use for bedding. And those crops, of course, grow. We plant them. Alfalfa will stay around for 4 to 5 years, and wheat will plant in the summer and harvest in about July. And so that's a good crop that stabilizes the soil and minimizes erosion, keeps the nutrients in the soil for the next crop. And then we're also able to, there's other products such as triticale and rye that we can also harvest. We plant over the winter and harvest in the spring for our cattle feed, but it's also good for the soil and for just managing erosion and nutrients. So.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Appreciate it. We're going to bring all of the panelists together at the end, but at this point, we're going to move to our last panelist, which is Dr. Fred Gingrich. He's a doctor of veterinary medicine and executive director of the American Association of Bovine Practitioners. They're the largest national cattle veterinarian association, and Fred lives here in Ohio. So we're going to talk to Fred a little bit more about the health and care of animals on the farms and what they do and what veterinarians and how they work with the farmers in Ohio. So Fred, are you unmuted and
Yes.
have your video on? Great. Thank you for being here today. So why don't you give kind of a brief overview of your background and how you got this role?
Yeah, thanks. So I grew up in Ohio, in the Findlay area, and went to veterinary school at Ohio State, graduated in '95, and I moved to California and worked there for 2 years, and then returned to Ashland, Ohio, and worked in private dairy practice, primarily dairy practice, and a little bit of beef for 20 years. And in 2016, the organization that I've been a member of for over 20 years was looking for a new executive director. I applied and they hired me. So now I am no longer in clinical practice. I manage our association.
Great. Thank you very much for that. That background, that you're born and raised here in Ohio. It's good to know. And, we know that as we hear a lot more questions and on social media and a variety of different areas, that there's a lot of interest about the care and welfare of animals on farms today. Can you tell us more about the relationship between a veterinarian and a beef dairy farmer, or what the animal and veterinarian relationship is like?
Sure. That's probably the thing I miss most about private practices, is the relationship that we had with dairy and beef producers, as a veterinarian. We formally call it a VCPR, which is veterinarian client patient relationship. And probably the thing that's a little bit different with a cattle veterinarian's role is that our patient is a herd. It's not necessarily an individual animal. And so we do a lot of things on a herd level. And, years ago when I first started in practice, especially on smaller dairies, it was a lot of individual animal care, similar to a human doctor and his or her patient. But the role of a cattle veterinarian really is to develop preventive medicine programs to improve the health, welfare, and productivity of all the animals on the farm from birth to death. And so that's really, I think, in general terms, what we do now.
Right. I know one of the questions I get quite often is, when calves are born on the farm, what is the relationship? What happens with those calves? And I know it's a little different for dairy and for beef. Can you share what are the practices and why?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so first, some people may not be aware that, we have some breeds of cattle that we use for milk. In Ohio, that's primarily going to be Holstein, Jersey, Guernseys. And then we have some breeds of cattle that we use primarily for beef production, although our Holsteins and cows, as well as the male calves, they do end up in the beef, into beef production too. So a beef calf is born, and earlier we were calling brood cows and mama cows, so we call them mama cows. That beef calf is born, and then typically it just stays with its mama for about the first 6 months of its life, and then it's weaned. And most beef calves spend the majority of their life on grass. That's also a little bit of a misnomer that beef is not produced on grass. It is. The primary way that we raise beef is on grass, and then they're finished on a higher concentrate, high carbohydrate diet, because just like in people, if you eat too many carbs, you get big, and we want that in our cattle. And then for dairy calves, it's a lot more labor intense. I'm sure Chris can attest to the fact that that 8 weeks of that calf's life, where they need fed 2 to 3 times a day, requires a lot of work on the dairy. And so there's a lot of care there, just like human babies require a lot of care. It's the same thing with the dairy calf. So that dairy calf is usually removed from its mother very soon after birth. And the primary reason we do that, there's 2 reasons. Number one, we milk the cow and we sell her product. So that's one reason. And then the other reason is their health and welfare. Calves can get hurt if they're around adult animals, especially dairy is a more, they're usually in a barn, where beef is a lot of times out on pasture all their life. And then calves, they're born without any immunity at all, without any antibodies. They require that colostrum from their mother, which is oftentimes bottle fed to the calf. And if we don't separate the calves from the cows, we will see higher disease in those animals. So that's primarily why we do it. And there's a variety of housing systems. Sometimes they're in individual pens, like what's behind me here at this dairy in the picture that's displayed. Sometimes we do paired housing. That's a new area of research right now, where we have 2 calves per group. That's a very exciting area of research, and what that does to the calf in terms of welfare and growth. And then we sometimes keep them in group pens, where we have anywhere from 5 to 15 animals per pen. And in some situations in those pens, we feed them with a robot feeder or group housing, group feeding. So there's a variety of systems that we utilize.
Great. And we're going to ask one more question of you, and then we're going to open it up to all of our panelists. So please put your questions into the Q&A, and we're going to get to everybody's questions for all 4 panelists. But Fred, one more question I wanted to ask you, because this is one, as a registered dietitian, Anna and I can both attest to, that we get quite a bit, is what is the role and use of antibiotics on a beef and a dairy farm, and does it end up in our food supply? We see the labels that say no antibiotics, and are they really not?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so, yes, we do use antibiotics. All antibiotics are, well, about the majority of antibiotics right now are under the oversight of a veterinarian, and soon all of them will be, with the FDA's new changes coming. But we use them for basically 3 big bucket reasons. One is treatment. So that's, you have an individual sick cow or calf that needs treatment. They have pneumonia, the cow has mastitis, they have foot rot, something like that. We give that animal an antibiotic. Another reason we do it is for prevention. It's very common that when a cow finishes her milking cycle, which is usually about 7 months, and then she, about 9 months, 9 to 10 months, and then we quit milking them for 2 months. And when they're quit milking, we usually administer what's called a dry cow tube. And then another reason would be control. Control of disease would be where an animal in a herd has it. It's a bad disease that we don't want. And so we use antibiotics to control the disease from spreading elsewhere. And a great example of that is a disease called anaplasmosis, which is spreading now. It used to be just in the southeast part of the United States. It's spread by a tick. And the only way to control that disease is by feeding the animals tetracycline. They can die if we don't do that. So we just do it during that vector season. And does it end up in the food supply? The answer is no, because every antibiotic, when it's approved, the sponsor or drug manufacturer has to provide the FDA with what we call a withdrawal interval. And so that means that animal cannot be sold for beef, or their milk cannot be sold for human consumption until a certain time. And that's when that antibiotic is out of their system to the level that's determined by the FDA.
And I think sometimes the confusion comes in when it says antibiotic free, maybe some of the differences between an organic milk or organic beef versus conventional.
Yeah, and so the way those animals are raised in the various programs is different. Okay, so with organic farms, those farms cannot use certain drugs. They can't use antibiotics. They can't use certain hormones, things like that. They can use some things. However, if an animal is sick in that production system, they should be treated and then they're removed from the organic program. That individual animal is. But the end product, the milk, the meat, it's the same. The way those animals are raised in the various programs is different, but the end product is the same.
That is going to be antibiotic free. And I think that is often confusing when we see that listed on the label. So then you assume that the other product must contain it if it doesn't. But there's federal laws as well, correct?
That's correct. There's federal laws. We have the pasteurized milk ordinance. We have federal regulations on antibiotic use. That's correct. No product has added antibiotics. No product has added hormones. Every animal has hormones. We would be dead without them. And so all organic milk has hormones, and so does the meat. And there's no difference in the level of hormones in any of the products. So they're marketing programs, but there's no indication of health or safety with those various programs, and one should not be inferred.
Great, thank you. We're going to open it up to questions to all of the panelists. So if you would all unmute yourself and start your videos. I'm going to stop my video so you guys all show up on the screen here. And we have so we open this up to questions at this time. We have some that have commented in the question area about this is amazing information, should be shared with the whole country, that there's a lot of, I think as we see generations removed from farms, a lot of people are getting their information maybe from social media or a friend or a peer or what's the marketing that's listed right on the label. So Anna, do you have any questions on your end?
Don't have any yet in the chat, but my one question would be, you know, if the panelists could give maybe one little snippet of information that they would like this audience to know. What's your key takeaway for the day as relevant to your discussion?
Well, this is Fred. I guess I would say it's always good to ask someone that's in the industry versus what you read on the internet, because the vast majority of what you read about beef or dairy production and our other food animal industries as well is just patently untrue. Do we have room to improve? Absolutely. And you heard what Chris said there about the improvements that he has made in his farm, and Dr. Turner. I mean, we're all improving and we want to improve. Otherwise, we won't be in business anymore, just like any business. But I would strongly recommend that anybody that has, it's best to ask an expert versus an activist.
We did have a question that came in here, and it says, why is this knowledge not more promoted by animal producers? We see plant-based misinformation and fear-mongering about animal husbandry seems to catch on fire, but the truth and sustainability in animal agriculture is not refuting them.
If I could, I'd take a stab at that one. There is a balancing act between constantly correcting the mistakes other folks are making and spending all your time doing that versus just doing what's right. And the Ohio Beef Council and our dairy folks, our pork producers organization, they all do a great job of trying to get the information out there. The challenge is, how do you do that? They all monitor social media. They respond there when they can. But at some point in time, if you are constantly refuting everything that's said wrong, it gets to the point where you're just engaging and arguing. So the information is available. It's just a lot of these organizations, Beef Council, the dairy folks, take it to the elementary schools and share it there and try to show those kids early on. We do a lot of this through the 4-H and FFA program. The 4-H thing, those kids are involved for 10 or 11 years in 4-H and some even a little bit longer. And they're exposed to all these things. So we're not just addressing the naysayers, but we're starting with young people and hoping to make them better consumers, quite frankly. We've got some programs here in the county where we allow the kids and encourage the kids as they finish their meat animal projects to go to the packing house with us and see exactly what they produced and then either market that product or consume it themselves. So a lot of different approaches to how you share the information. Not always the best is to argue with somebody that they're constantly wrong, but to maybe start a little bit younger and share with young people and hopefully turn them into a whole generation of better consumers. And in a lot of cases, those kids will share that information with their adults back home and share the message. But there's nothing secretive about this. All these organizations do their best to share the facts.
Yeah, thank you, Stan. I think as dietitians, who we have quite a few in the audience, we can relate to that sentiment. It's challenging to address people that have already made up their minds, but starting with the youth definitely can make some changes. We do have another question for Chris and Tom. Why did you choose to become farmers, and what makes you get out of bed in the morning?
You want to go, Chris?
You can go, Tom.
Well, I guess I've grown up with it. Cattle are my life, and there's nothing better than when a brand new calf is born. To look at it, to experience that is something that a lot of people don't have that opportunity. I think we're driven by, in our case, we're in the seed stock business to improve this breed, to make cattle better. So we're anxious to look at the next matings and see what that results in. And so that does get us up and going every day to just try to make that product better. In terms of the grass, you ask about what I would leave with them. I think in terms of soil health and grass production, obviously the better our soils are and the better we can keep them, and we can produce more grass through grazing management, then we can have more cows and they will grow faster. So it all fits together, and there's no reason we would want to harm our soils or to not do the best job we can. It's just logical to do that. So, and that keeps us going here as well, the constant maintenance of things and growing things. So that's where I'm at.
Yeah, and I would say that I actually went to college thinking I was going to go into medicine, and had the opportunity to partner with my dad and build this dairy. And you know, I could in the end, what gets me up in the morning is I'm outdoors. Sure, when it's 30 below zero, is that super fun? No, not really. But we dig in, and actually, what's exciting about even those cold, there's been times when it's super cold, and I'll sit out here and I say, man, I'm just so happy my employees are here helping take care of the cows. And it does come back to that we're doing, you know, we're working in the environment, we're working in ground that surrounds us, we're working with animals that we love. And people come back, my staff comes because they want to be around the animals. Sure, there are days that are tough, and there are days that I wish didn't happen, but that's just because you're dealing with animals and weather, and sometimes they don't all listen, I guess. If I were to say my one takeaway is I thought through the years of my experience as a dairy farmer that I really feel like we're dealing with what's best for the cows, what's best to keep ourselves and what's best for the environment, and what's best for the consumer. And those three circles can be very complicated and very important all at the same time, because all three are what make us tick and are kind of exciting challenges, but as referenced, hard to educate, hard to understand, and create a constant goal to strive towards being better and aligning those three areas.
Thank you. We do have a couple of more questions that have come in through the Q&A. And one of them is in regards to ruminants do play an important role, a symbiotic role with our ecosystem, which we were kind of sharing in regards to that circle of animals and the role they play also in plants. So at this time, the significant detriment or environmental and human and animal health, when animals are grown in, this is more about some of the larger animal feeding operations, the impact on animal production is a factor in regards to the scale and the size. Do you know of what is being done on the state or national level to support small and medium scale production, as well as some of these larger farms?
Well, one thing I would say is that I don't believe it's true that that the environmental impact is based upon the size of the operation. That's if you look at one of the things like in the beef production system, those animals end up on feedlots. We call them feedlots or feed yards, and some of them can be very big. If you go to the plains area of the country, where you could have 50 to 80,000 animals on there, but there are significant benefits to that. One is when we finish animals on grain, they eructate less methane. So it is, and they finish much quicker versus an animal on grass that takes much longer to reach market weight. And ruminants, the reason they eructate methane is because they're chewing forage. And so when we change them to a concentrate diet, that is lessened. And then the second thing I think with that, if you look at larger operations, they have the opportunity to do things that smaller operations cannot do, such as if you look at Chris's dairy, Bridgewater, versus some of the dairies in my area, they fill up a tanker load of milk, and so it's one stop. If you look at some of the small dairies, that milk truck has to stop at numerous farms to get a load, then to go to the processor. If you look at a very large feeding operation in the plains area of the States, there are processing facilities right next door. And so the fuel, which is the primary driver of climate change, is fossil fuels. There's much less driving. So it's a complicated issue, but you have to look at the end product environmental impact. A small farm that maybe is an organic dairy that produces 40 pounds of milk per cow, in my opinion, has a larger environmental impact per gallon of milk than a dairy of Chris's size that milks 4,500 cows and averages over 80 pounds of milk. So I think that you have to look at it from the end product, not the number of animals on the operation.
And I would add, go ahead, Sam.
No, go ahead, Chris.
And I would add, as I referenced earlier, at the larger size, we have, number one, we have rules and regulations, but we also have a methane digester, which is actually taking the methane out of the risk, the carbon risk there of the methane out of the atmosphere, and we're putting it into something that can be reused. And with our regulations, we're being tracked in how we manage our manure, phosphorus, and nitrogen, and verified where it's being put into the soil. So I think, and I truly believe all farms are doing the best things that they can do with the manure to manage their crop, because if you abuse your soil, you're not going to grow a crop which isn't going to create a good quality feed for your animals. So it's still the same cycle.
I would echo what both Chris and Fred have said. It's important to keep in mind that the average mama cow, brood cow herd in Ohio is less than 17 head. So there are lots of opportunities for small farms as well as large farms, and there are benefits to both. Those small producers, or the average and under, take their calves and market them, and oftentimes they get commingled into larger feedlots. The opportunity, if they keep them at home and finish them, is that they can sell freezer beef directly to the consumer, which some of the large feedlots aren't equipped to do. But you take the opportunities that the large feedlots have, they're able to use byproduct feeds and semi-load lots that small producers can't, wet distillers grains. They can use them efficiently and quickly. Lots of opportunities that larger feedlots can take advantage of. Same way with hauling manure. They can have manure facilities that allow them to actually, we're doing a lot of work now with extension and side dressing corn, capturing the nitrogen, which we've not been able to do until recently, by literally knifing liquid manure down the rows from some of those larger facilities. Smaller facilities aren't able to do that because they don't have the size and scale in order to supply a feeder line or a hose or the fields that would be necessary to make that affordable. So there's lots of room for both, and there are advantages to both. And quite frankly, over the last several decades, close to a century, we've all learned to live together and all learned to find our niche within the supply chain.
Thank you. And I think we do find all of those best practices occurring on all size farms in Ohio, which is great. And you guys reinforce that with your answers that you gave. We just have a couple of minutes here left. I know that we did have a dietitian that actually is a school food service director, K through 12. And she likes to run videos while her kids are standing in line ready to pick up their breakfast or lunch or whatever it might be. And so we are going to share both the Ohio Beef Council and the American Dairy Association Mid-East. We have lots of farmers telling their stories about right here in Ohio about how the food, the milk, the beef, whatever got onto their tray or into their menu that day. So we will be happy to share out links to all kinds of videos that if anybody else can use them in their place of work as well. So love that question. 1 minute left. Any final thoughts in regards to sustainability and what that means in Ohio? If any of you have a final comment you want to make.
I just had one. I think it's important for us as educators to get people to understand the ruminant system, that cellulose material that's grown, as Stan said earlier, on about 30% of the ground that cannot be tilled. The ruminant system is the link between that non-arable soils and human consumption, whether it's cattle, sheep, or goats. That's the link, because they can, in the rumen can digest cellulose and turn that into energy and then eventually a protein product. So it's absolutely critical. People say we need less cattle or sheep or goats. I would argue we need more. So that's my take.
Thank you very much. And on that note, on behalf of the American Dairy Association Mideast and the Ohio Beef Council, we want to thank you for attending today's webinar, Ohio's Role in Sustainable Food System, and for our panelists today for that engaging conversation in regards to animal agriculture in Ohio. And we hope that you have enjoyed learning how Ohio places an incredible emphasis on environmental stewardship, animal care, technology, and research. So as you exit the webinar, you're going to find a link to complete a survey to provide us with some feedback on today's webinar, and your CPE certificate will be sent to you in the next couple of days via email. So watch your email for that to come through. And again, please visit our websites for some of the videos and additional information that we shared. And any questions, you will, in your follow-up email, you'll have links to both of our email addresses. You can be sure to continue to ask questions or questions that come up later. So thank you very much and have a great day.